The Anunnaki appeared in the very first Mesopotamian religious beliefs as powerful forces that controlled the order of the universe between the heavens and the ground. They show up in the oldest surviving cuneiform writing from southern Mesopotamia, where Sumerian writers first recorded their religious ideas on clay tablets around 3200 BCE. These gods meant much more than just gods shaped like humans. They represented the actual framework of reality itself, working as the divine builders who set up the borders between the world of heaven and life on earth. The name Anunnaki comes from the Sumerian word Anuna, which literally means children of Anu or those from Anu's family line. Anu, also written as in later Akkadian writings, stood as the highest sky god whose kingdom included the tallest heavens. The ending kai means earth or ground, creating a combined word that basically describes gods whose power reaches from the heavenly area to the earthly world. This word structure shows how the Sumerians thought about god rankings, where the Anunnaki functioned as middlemen connecting the impossible-to-reach cosmic heights and the real world where humans lived. Early Sumerian religious growth shows the slow forming of Anunnaki identity through many generations of religious writings. The first mentions appear in business documents from Uruk and where temple lists mention gifts given to the Anuna who judge and the greater Anuna of heaven and earth. These short mentions suggest that, by 3000 BCE, the idea of a group god assembly had already become part of Sumerian religious activities. The Sumerian king list, written during the third dynasty of around 2100 BCE, but including much older stories, gives important proof for understanding where the Anunnaki came from. The writing begins with the famous statement that kingship came down from heaven, setting up the basic idea that earthly power comes from God's command. The list section before the flood describes rulers whose kingdoms lasted impossibly long times. Enlil of Eridu ruled for 28,800 years, while Enlil of Bad Tabira led for 43,200 years. These huge numbers show Sumerian understanding of cosmic time lengths and suggest that early kingship worked under direct Anunnaki watching. Archaeological proof from Eridu, traditionally thought of as the first city, shows the physical setting where Anunnaki worship grew. Digging has uncovered 17 layers of temples in a row dating from around 5000 BCE, with the earlier buildings showing fancy architectural planning that would become typical of Mesopotamian religious buildings. The temple's direction toward cardinal points and its raised platform design show cosmic ideas that later writings clearly connect with Anunnaki divine building methods. The creation stories preserved at Eridu show the Anunnaki as active participants in world creation rather than distant observers. The Eridu Genesis, known from old Babylonian copies but showing much older Sumerian stories, describes how the Anunnaki built the first cities and chose kings to rule humanity. The writing states that after the gods had made mankind, the Anunnaki, the great gods, held a meeting and gave out the fates. This part shows the group nature of Anunnaki decision-making and their job as cosmic lawmakers. Nippur's religious records give additional understanding into Anunnaki religious growth through the study of Enlil worship. As the city that held Mesopotamia's most important religious place, Nippur kept stories that explain the connection between individual gods and the larger Anunnaki group. The Tamil writing dating to the III time describes how one ruler after another fixed Enlil's temple for the Anunnaki who decided fate, showing that even the highest gods like Enlil worked within the bigger system of Anunnaki power. Cuneiform sources from Nippur also keep the earliest forms of writings that would later become part of the Mesopotamian story collection. The piece known as Enlil and Ninlil has detailed descriptions of god meetings where the Anunnaki talk about things affecting both gods and humans. These meetings happen in the Shekinah, a cosmic room where the gods come together to decide fates. The writing describes how 50 greater Anunnaki and 7 Anunnaki, who decide fate, take part in these talks, setting up number systems that would continue throughout Mesopotamian religious history. The separation between Anunnaki and other god groups becomes clear through careful study of religious word meanings. The Igigi, whose name comes from a root meaning to see or to watch, stood for a separate class of gods connected with heavenly watching and star-study events. While the Anunnaki controlled basic cosmic rules, the Igigi did more specialized jobs related to fortune-telling and the reading of heavenly signs. Sumerian writings always keep this separation, with the Igigi appearing as lower than the Anunnaki in matters of final power. The seven who decide fate made another separate god group, though one closely connected with the Anunnaki ranking system. These seven gods had specific duty for figuring out individual and group fates, working as a leadership council within the larger Anunnaki meeting. The number 7 held special meaning in Mesopotamian universe study, showing the 7 visible planets and the 7-day week that organized both god and human time living. Word study shows the change of Anunnaki word meanings across different times and areas of Mesopotamia. Early Sumerian writings used different spellings and grammar buildings that suggest different ways various city-states understood these gods. The Phara time writings show making things the same beginning to appear as political joining created pressure for religious sameness across Sumerian lands. The connection between Anunnaki and cosmic land features becomes clear through looking at temple building design and ritual activities. Ziggurats, the huge step towers that stood out in Mesopotamian cities, worked as physical pictures of the cosmic mountain where heaven and earth met. These buildings gave platforms for Anunnaki worship and showed the god ranking through their rising levels. The Anu ziggurat at Uruk, given to the father of the Anunnaki, shows this building of religion through its impressive height and careful star lineups. Religious calendars kept in cuneiform records show how Anunnaki worship organized the yearly cycle of festivals and celebrations. The Akitu celebration, written about from the earliest Sumerian time through the end of Mesopotamian culture, focused on the renewal of god kingship through Anunnaki approval. During this festival, the ruling king went through ritual steps that symbolically recreated the original god appointment of earthly rulers. The money parts of Anunnaki worship came clearly from temple business records. These places controlled huge farming lands, craft workshops, and trade networks that created the wealth needed to support complex ritual cycles. The Drehim records dating to the Ur-II time write down thousands of animals killed for various Anunnaki throughout the year, showing the huge amount of resources given to keeping God's favor. Picture proof from cylinder seals and temple carvings gives visual records of how Mesopotamians imagined Anunnaki looks and features. These gods typically appear wearing horned crowns that show god status, with the number of horn pairs showing relative rank within the heavenly ranking. Their clothes show the fancy fabrics connected with royal power, while their poses show the dignified manner right for cosmic rulers. The joining of Anunnaki religion with hands-on ruling becomes clear through looking at law books and business documents. The Code of Ur-Nammu, the earliest known legal collection, begins with the statement that the king got his power from En and Enlil, setting up the rule that earthly justice comes from God's command. This legal system positioned the Anunnaki as final guarantors of social order and moral actions. The business complexity of Anunnaki ruling centered around 3 highest gods whose matching areas set up the basic structure of cosmic power. Anu, Enlil, and Enki formed what Babylonian religious teachers called the group of 3 great gods, each controlling important parts of universal order while keeping group duty for big decisions affecting both God and human worlds. This 3-leader system came from earlier Sumerian stories, but reached its most fancy form during the Old Babylonian time when writers at Babylon, Sippar, and Nippur explained the connections between these highest powers. Anu's position as Sky Father put him at the top of God ranking, though his power worked through giving jobs to others rather than direct action. Cuneiform writings always describe him as living in the highest heaven, kept away from daily running things, but working as final judge in arguments between lesser gods. The Babylonian creation story Enuma Elish shows Anu as having the Anu power, a cosmic force that could be moved to other gods during times of danger. When Tiamat threatened the set-up order, Anu tried to face the ancient chaos goddess but found his power not enough, finally passing his power to Marduk for the final battle. This story shows how Anu's highest position worked through organized systems rather than personal fighting ability. Temple records from Uruk show the hands-on expressions of Anu's power through complex ritual cycles that made his cosmic kingship stronger. The Anu temple complex, rebuilt many times throughout Mesopotamian history, had a special building plan that stressed vertical climbing toward the god world. Priests climbing the ziggurats many levels symbolically traveled the cosmic ranking, with each platform standing for a different area of god power. The temple's sacred marriage room at its top gave the setting for yearly rituals that renewed Anu's cosmic rule through joining with Inanna, the goddess of love and war. Enlil's control over air events and earthly power positioned him as the most actively involved member of the god group of three in earthly business. Babylonian sources always identify him as Lord of the Hurricane and King of the Lands, titles that showed his control over both natural forces and political buildings. The Nippur temple records keep detailed accounts of how Enlil's priests read weather events as showings of God's will, with storms, floods, and no rain working as talking from the god to his human subjects. These readings carried big political weight as rulers throughout Mesopotamia looked for Enlil's approval for war campaigns, legal changes, and big building projects. The Code of Hammurabi gives solid proof of Enlil's job in making royal power right. The law book's opening declares that Anu and Enlil chose Hammurabi to cause justice to win in the land, setting up the legal rule that earthly rulers get their power from God command. This idea of God-approved kingship needed constant renewal through ritual watching at Enlil's Nippur place, where kings from across Mesopotamia traveled to get formal knowledge of their right to rule. The Tamil Chronicle writes down many times when rulers who lost favor after ignoring their duties to Enlil's temple, causing war losses and political shakiness. Enlil's power reached beyond political approval to include the basic forces that kept up farming culture. Sumerian hymns describe him as a lord of plenty who controlled the flooding of rivers, the baby-making ability of soil, and the making ability of farm animals. The Farmer's Almanac, a hands-on farming guide kept in many copies, begins with prayers to Enlil. These writings show how religious ideas changed into hands-on guidance for the farming activities that supported Mesopotamian city centers. Enki's area of influence included both the freshwater sources needed for water system farming and the mental abilities that made human culture possible. Babylonian mythology always shows him as humanity's supporter and protector, the god who gave the knowledge and skills needed for city life. The Atrahasis story describes how Enki secretly warned the flood hero of coming destruction, going against the other god's choice to get rid of humanity through disaster flood. This story sets up Enki as a go-between figure between god power and human doing well, a job that made him different from his more distant work partners in the highest group of three. The Eridu temple group given to Enki worship worked as Mesopotamia's most important center for teacher and technical learning. Archaeological proof shows big scribal schools, workshops for craftsmen, and laboratories where priests did early forms of chemical and medical testing. The temple's library had complete collections of technical guides covering water system engineering, metal working, fabric making, and medicine making. These hands-on uses of god wisdom showed how Enki's religious job changed into solid benefits for human society. Enki's connection with the Abzu, the freshwater ocean under the earth, linked him to the water systems that made Mesopotamian farming possible. Sumerian hymns describe him as Lord of the Flowing Water, who directed the underground streams that fed rivers, canals, and wells. The Enki and Ninursag story gives detailed accounts of how the god set up water networks and taught humans the ways needed for handling water supplies. These stories worked for both religious and hands-on purposes, keeping technical knowledge within religious systems that made sure it passed across generations. The meeting of great gods worked as a god lawmaking body that talked about things affecting cosmic order and human culture. Babylonian sources described this meeting as including 50 Anunnaki who came together in the Upshakina, a cosmic room located in Enlil's Nippur place. The meeting's happenings followed formal rules that matched earthly legal places, with chosen speakers giving cases, witnesses giving testimony, and judges making choices based on set-up earlier examples. The Epic of Gilgamesh keeps detailed descriptions of these god talks, particularly the meeting's choice to punish Gilgamesh and Enkidu for killing the bull of heaven and Humbaba. Job roles within the god meeting showed specialized areas of cosmic duty. Ninhursag, the mother goddess, watched over things related to childbirth, baby-making, and the keeping going of species. Her power reached to both god and human making babies, with writings describing how she shaped the first humans from clay and set up the biological ways that controlled population growth. The Enki and Ninhursag piece details her job in creating different life forms and setting up the natural cycles that kept up nature balance. Nana, the moon god, controlled time measuring and the calendar systems that organized both religious and everyday activities. Babylonian star study writings describe his movement through the heavens as giving the basic rhythm for farming, business, and ritual cycles. His temple at held fancy star-watching places where priests tracked moon phases and figured out the complex adjustments needed to keep calendar rightness. These figuring-outs needed advanced math skills and stood for one of Mesopotamian culture's most important thinking achievements. Udu, the sun god, ran justice and worked as god witness to promises and deals. His daily trip across the sky positioned him as the perfect watcher of human actions, able to see all actions done under his light. Legal documents often call on Udu as promise keeper of deal duties, with promise breakers facing god punishment in the form of sickness, poorness, or social shame. The Code of Hammurabi shows Udu giving the law symbols to the king, setting up the rule that earthly justice showed cosmic moral order. Family connections within the Anunnaki group created complex networks of power and duty that influenced god decision-making. Marduk's status as Enki's son positioned him as inheritor to his father's wisdom, while setting up his claim to highest power in Babylonian religion. The Enuma Elish describes Marduk's slow collecting of power through successful finishing of harder and harder challenges, reaching its high point in his winning over Tiamat and choosing as king of the gods. This story worked for both religious and political purposes, making Babylon's rise to area control right, while explaining the moving of highest power from older Sumerian gods to their Babylonian followers. The connection between Enlil and his sons Nana and Ninurta created another big power group within the god ranking. Nana's control over time cycles went well with his father's power over earthly business, while Ninurta's job as god warrior gave war support for Enlil's political choices. The Ninurta stories describe big campaigns against different monsters and rebels, with the gods' winnings working to keep cosmic order against chaotic forces. These stories stress the importance of god war power in keeping the setup ranking against inside and outside threats. Marriage connections among the Anunnaki created more bonds that influenced god politics. Nana's joining with Ningal made Udu and Inanna, creating a moon-sun family that controlled both time measuring and justice running. Inanna's marriage to Dumuzi, though ending sadly with his death and going down to the underworld, set up important connections between the heavenly gods and the powers controlling the world of the dead. These story connections gave religious explanations for natural events, while creating story systems that kept important cultural values. The idea of God meeting decision-making ways appears most clearly in story literature, where big plot happenings come from formal talks among the gods. The Atrahasis story describes the meeting's choice to make the human population smaller through plague, hunger, and finally flood, with each action needing formal debate and most votes' approval. Enki's standing against these actions creates dramatic tension, while showing how individual gods could challenge group choices through proper ways rather than direct fighting. The Gilgamesh story gives another detailed example of God meeting ways in its account of the gods' answer to Gilgamesh's killing of Humbaba and the Bull of Heaven. The meeting must figure out the right punishment for these acts of going against God power, with different gods giving arguments for different penalties. The final choice to condemn Enkidu to death stands for a middle ground that satisfies demands for justice while avoiding direct fighting with Gilgamesh's god protectors. These meeting ways showed a fancy understanding of group decision-making that matched growth in human political places. The need for formal debate, giving of proof, and most votes' approval created checks against random god action, while making sure that big choices showed wide agreement among the cosmic powers. This way complexity made Mesopotamian religion different from simpler systems, where highest gods used unlimited power over both God and human worlds. The religious system set up by the Anunnaki group found its deepest showing in creation stories that positioned humanity as God-crafted workers designed to serve the gods' earthly needs. The Atrahasis story, kept in many forms spanning from Old Babylonian to Neo-Assyrian times, gives the most complete account of humanity's beginnings within Anunnaki universe study. This piece, whose title comes from its flood hero's name meaning very wise, describes how the gods made humans solve a god-work crisis that threatened the stability of cosmic order. The story's opening parts set up the basic problem that needed human creation. The Igigi gods, responsible for keeping the gods' earthly lands, had grown tired of their endless work. For 40 years, these lesser gods dug canals, built temples, and did the farming work needed to keep up god culture. Their fighting back began with work stops and protests, growing to open going again when they burned their tools and surrounded Enlil's home in Nippur. The writing describes how the Igigi carried fire. They filled their tools with fire. Fire to the hoe flamed the spade, creating a danger that demanded quick solution from the highest Anunnaki. Enlil's first answer involved calling the god meeting to address this never-before challenge to cosmic power. The god's alarm at finding armed fighters at his doorstep shows the serious nature of the threat posed by God's work troubles. The meeting talks done in the Upshakina room needed careful thinking of how to keep needed work while addressing real complaints from the Igigi. The solution suggested by Enki showed his typical wisdom and care for hands-on problem solving. Create a new group of beings specifically designed for work, by this freeing the Igigi from their heavy duties while making sure they continued making things. The actual way of human creation involves fancy religious ideas that show Mesopotamian understanding of the connection between God and human living. Enki's plan needed the killing of Wailu, described as a god who has thinking ability, whose blood would give the needed god part for human nature. This killing happened during the new moon when cosmic forces lined up well for creation activities. The writing says that Nintu, the birth goddess, mixed the killed god's blood with clay to form the basic human stuff, with the god blood giving thinking ability and the clay giving physical form. The creation involved 14 birth goddesses, each responsible for making one male and one female human. This multiplying through god midwifery made sure genetic variety while setting up the baby-making ability needed for human population growth. The writing describes how these goddesses pinched off 14 pieces of clay and shaped them into human forms through a way that took 10 months, matching normal pregnancy times. The resulting humans had enough thinking ability to understand God commands, while lacking the power to challenge their creator's power. Enki's stepping in during human creation carried deep religious meanings that made him different from other Anunnaki and set up his job as humanity's God supporter. His choice to give humans God-thinking ability, despite knowing this gift would in the end lead to problems, showed a complex understanding of the connection between wisdom and suffering. The god's secret adding of extra god essence to human nature, beyond what the meeting had said yes to, stood for an act of God fighting back that would have far-reaching results for both gods and humans. This religious tension between group god power and individual god conscience appears throughout Mesopotamian writings as a returning theme. Enki's willingness to go against meeting choices when they went against his personal right and wrong set up patterns for god disagreement that would later appear in his protection of humanity during the flood. The god's actions raised basic questions about the nature of god power and the amount to which individual gods could go after independent policies that went against group choices. The Atrahasis story's treatment of human creation also addressed hands-on worries about the connection between God and human work. The writing says that humans would carry the load of the gods, taking over the farming and building work that had before burdened the Igigi. This setup created a three-level cosmic ranking with the greater Anunnaki at the top, the Igigi working as middle management, and humans doing hand work at the bottom. The systems working well depended on keeping clear borders between these groups, while making sure enough payment for each level's help. The Epic of Gilgamesh gives more viewpoints on human creation that add to and sometimes go against the Atrahasis' account. In this piece, the goddess Aruru makes Enkidu from clay in answer to prayers asking for a companion for Gilgamesh. The creation way involves the goddess washing her hands, pinching off clay, and throwing it onto the step where it takes the form of a wild man covered with hair. This more sudden creation method goes against the detailed meeting ways described in Atrahasis, suggesting different religious stories about the methods of God making things. Enkidu's starting state as a wild man who lives among animals and drinks from streams stands for humanity's original condition before having culture. His changing through contact with a temple prostitute who teaches him human customs shows the way by which God wisdom makes natural human feelings into cultured feelings. The 7 days and nights of sexual teaching that humanize Enkidu match creation stories, in which God knowledge changes raw human material into cultured beings able to do city life. The Enuma Elish gives yet another viewpoint on human beginnings that stresses Marduk's job as creator god following his winning over Tiamat. In this form, Marduk suggests making humans to serve the gods after setting up cosmic order through his beating of ancient chaos. The story describes how E suggested using Kingu's blood, since this fighter god carried the main duty for organizing standing against the younger generation of gods. The creation involves mixing Kingu's blood with clay to make humans who will carry the service of the gods, that they might be at ease. This forms stress on using a fighter god's blood for human creation carries different religious meanings than the Atrahasis' account. Rather than killing a god with thinking ability, the Enuma Elish uses the blood of a beaten enemy, suggesting that human nature has elements of both god wisdom and fighting back feelings. This two-sidedness explains humanity's ability for both great doings and destroying actions, giving religious reason for the moral complexity that describes human culture. Comparing these creation accounts shows big differences in how different Mesopotamian stories understood humanity's connection to the god world. The Atrahasis story stresses humanity's job as god-made workers whose main purpose involves serving the gods' material needs. The Gilgamesh story focuses more on the making cultured way that changes natural humans into city people able to do fancy cultural doings. The Enuma Elish shows human creation as part of Marduk's bigger program of cosmic organizing, following his taking of the highest god power. These differences show different area and time viewpoints on basic religious questions about human nature and fate. Sumerian stories, kept most clearly in the Atrahasis story, stressed humanity's lower status and duty to serve God needs. Later Babylonian pieces showed greater interest in human potential for wisdom and cultural doing, while keeping the basic system of God being higher. Assyrian forms often stressed the importance of royal power as God showing on earth, connecting human creation to political rightness. The idea of God image appears in different forms throughout these creation stories, though its exact meaning stays subject to religious debate throughout Mesopotamian history. The word Salmu literally means statue or picture, suggesting that humans functioned as physical showings of God's presence in the earthly world. This reading positioned humanity as living icons that made God power visible and able to be reached to human seeing, similar to how temple statues worked as focal points for God worship. Other readings of Salmu stressed job-related rather than physical looking alike between gods and humans. According to this understanding, humans carried God image through their ability for rational thought, moral choosing, and creative activity rather than through physical looks. This job-related reading explained how humans could work as God representatives while staying clearly lower than their creators in power and authority. The religious debate over God image carried hands-on meanings for how Mesopotamian societies understood human rights and duties. If humans carried a God image through rational ability, Then learning and thinking growth stood for religious duties that honored the gods who gave these gifts. If God's image involved physically looking alike, then proper care for human bodies and respect for human worth became forms of God worship that said yes to the god's creative power. Law books throughout Mesopotamian history showed these religious ideas through rules that protected human life and worth, while keeping clear separations between social classes. The Code of Hammurabi's step-by-step punishments for crimes against persons of different social status showed how God image ideas interacted with hands-on social rankings. Free citizens got greater protection than slaves, but even slaves had certain rights that said yes to their taking part in God nature through human form. Temple records write down complex rituals designed to honor the gods for their gift of human creation, while saying yes to humanity's ongoing duties to God power. New Year festivals included ceremonies that symbolically acted out against human creation, with priests molding clay figures while saying appropriate prayers. These rituals worked for both teaching and devotional purposes, teaching people taking part about their beginnings while making stronger their duties to serve God needs through temple support and moral actions. The money meanings of creation religion appear clearly in temple business documents that detail the huge resources given to keeping divine service. Thousands of workers labored in temple fields, workshops, and building projects that kept up complex ritual cycles honoring the creator gods. These money setups changed religious ideas about human purpose into hands-on systems that organized large-scale making things activities around religious duties. Medical writings keep more proof of how creation of religion influenced hands-on understanding of human nature and health. Mesopotamian doctors understood sickness as coming from God displeasure or demon interference with the god's creative work. Treatment plans typically combine hands-on remedies with ritual ways designed to restore proper connections between patients and their god creators. This complete approach showed religious understanding of humans as combined beings whose physical and spiritual parts needed put-together care. The keeping of creation stories across many thousands of years shows their basic importance for Mesopotamian cultural identity and religious activities. Scribes continuously copied, edited, and reinterpreted these writings to address changing political and social conditions, while keeping core religious rules about humanity's God beginnings and ongoing duties. This writing tradition gave stability and continuity that helped Mesopotamian culture keep unified cultural identity, despite frequent political upsets and foreign takeovers. The religious tensions built into humanity's creation as God workers unavoidably led to conflicts that would reach their high point in the most disaster-like choice recorded in Mesopotamian literature. The Anunnaki's group figuring out to destroy their human creations through a devastating flood. The Atrahasis story gives the most detailed account of the situations that led to this god judgment, describing how human population growth and cultural growth created unexpected problems that challenged the cosmic order the gods had set up. Within 600 years of human creation, the earth had become thickly populated with doing-well communities that created constant noise and activity. The cuneiform writing describes how the land bellowed like a bull and the god grew restless at their noise. This disturbance proved particularly troublesome for Enlil, whose power over earthly business made him directly responsible for keeping order among human populations. The god's complaints focus not just on noise levels, but on humanity's increasing freedom from direct God watching as growing populations developed their own social places and cultural activities that worked with minimal reference to God power. Archaeological proof from sites like Tel Es-Sawin and Choga Mami supports the stories showing of rapid population growth during the 6,000-year period BCE, when better farming ways and water systems enabled larger settlements to keep themselves going throughout seasonal changes. These communities developed fancy craft specializing, long-distance trade networks, and running systems that made less their dependence on temple places for money coordinating. The resulting cultural freedom stood for a big departure from the original God plan, which had imagined humans as obedient workers under direct godly watching. Enlil's first tries to control human population growth involved sending plagues and hungers that would make numbers smaller to able to manage levels without completely getting rid of the species. The Atrahasis story describes three one after another tries at population control, each involving different god agents and methods. The first plague, run through Namtar, the plague god, aimed at specific age groups and social classes to achieve population rebalancing without messing up needed farming. When this selective approach proved not enough, Enlil said yes to more complete hunger conditions that would force human communities to compete for scarce supplies. The god's strategy involved changing weather patterns and farming conditions to create widespread food shortages that would naturally make population levels smaller through starvation and conflict. Adad, the storm god, held back the seasonal rains that enabled crop growth, while other gods responsible for baby-making and plenty withdrew their support from human farming activities. The resulting hungers achieved temporary population reductions but failed to address the basic problem of human cultural freedom that worried Enlil most deeply. Enki's repeated stepping in to help humanity during these dangers created mounting tension within the god meeting and set up the religious system for the flood story. The gods' giving of other food sources, water system ways, and survival strategies enabled human communities to weather god punishment more successfully than Enlil had expected. These steppings in violated the meeting's group choices and stood for a form of god not following orders that challenged the ranking power structure controlling Anunnaki connections. The growing conflict between Enlil and Enki showed deeper religious questions about the nature of god justice and the amount to which individual gods could go after independent policies that went against group choices. Enlil's position stressed the importance of keeping cosmic order through strict forcing of god power, while Enki's actions suggested that wisdom and caring should moderate the use of god power. This basic disagreement about god ruling would reach its high point in the flood choice and what happened after. The meeting's final choice to destroy humanity through flood stood for a middle ground that addressed Enlil's worries about human freedom while giving a definitive solution to the population problem. The Atrahasis story describes detailed talks in which different gods gave arguments for different approaches to the human danger. Some gods supported Enlil's position that complete destruction was needed to restore proper cosmic order, while others spoke for more moderate actions that would keep human culture while addressing real god worries. The floodway itself showed a fancy understanding of water engineering and weather ways that described Mesopotamian culture's connection with its river environment. The gods' choice to overwhelm existing flood control systems through coordinated attacks on many fronts showed their complete knowledge of the infrastructure that kept up human settlements. Adad would give unprecedented rainfall from above, while Enki would release underground waters from the Abzu, creating a dual assault that would overwhelm even the most fancy human engineering projects. The meeting's promise of keeping secret about the flood plan created the dramatic tension that drives the story forward and sets up Enki's moral problem. The gods swore binding promises that stopped them from directly warning humans about the coming destruction, but these restrictions applied only to direct talking rather than indirect methods that kept the letter while violating the spirit of the agreement. Enki's solution involved speaking to the reed wall of Atrahasis's house rather than to the man himself, a technical following of the promise that enabled him to give needed survival information. The directions Enki gave to Atrahasis through this indirect talking method show detailed knowledge of shipbuilding ways and survival strategies that show actual Mesopotamian sea technology. The god set exact dimensions for the vessel that would keep human and animal life through the flood, 120 cubits in length, width, and height, creating a perfect cube that symbolized cosmic completeness. The ship's building needed specific materials including palm fiber, bitumen, and different types of wood that were readily available in southern Mesopotamia and had the waterproofing qualities needed for extended ocean traveling. The 7-day building time that Enki allowed for the ark's finishing matched the cosmic week that organized God and human time living throughout Mesopotamian culture. This timeline needed Atrahasis to mobilize big community supplies and work while keeping secrecy about the project's true purpose. The writing describes how the builder gave food and drink for his workers while turning aside questions about the vessel's meant use, claiming it was designed for a trading trip to distant lands. The loading of animals onto the ark followed systematic ways that showed fancy understanding of species keeping and nature connections. Atrahasis gathered breeding pairs of wild animals while also including domestic species that would be needed for re-establishing farming culture after the flood waters went down. The writing says that clean animals were taken in groups of 7 pairs, while unclean species were limited to single pairs, setting up separations that would later appear in Hebrew flood stories, but showed earlier Mesopotamian ideas about ritual purity and killing animals for gods. The flood itself began with supernatural events that announced the cosmic importance of the coming destruction. The Atrahasis story describes how normal weather patterns stopped as god forces took direct control of air and water systems. Darkness covered the earth even during daylight hours, while earthquake shaking announced the release of underground waters that would add to the torrential rains. These early signs gave final warnings for any humans who had enough wisdom to read God talking through natural events. The actual deluge combined many water sources in a coordinated assault that overwhelmed all existing flood control infrastructure. Adad's storms gave continuous rainfall that went beyond the ability of drainage systems, while the Anunnaki together opened the fountains of the Great Deep that released underground water reserves. The Epic of Gilgamesh's parallel account describes how even the gods were frightened by the flood's intensity, with Ishtar crying out in distress at the destruction of her human worshippers and the Anunnaki cowering like dogs in the highest heavens. The 7-day lasting time of the flood properly matched the cosmic week while giving enough time for complete flooding of lived-in areas. The waters rose above the highest mountains, getting rid of all land life except for the carefully kept specimens aboard Atrahasis's vessel. The writing describes how human settlements, temples, and farming infrastructure disappeared beneath the expanding waters, erasing thousands of years of cultural growth and technology in a matter of days. The mind impact of the flood on the god meeting became clear as the destruction went beyond what many gods had expected or wanted. The Gilgamesh form describes Ishtar's regret at supporting the flood choice, while other gods showed dismay at the complete getting rid of the worship and offerings that had kept up god-human connections. These emotional answers show the amount to which the gods had become dependent on human service, and highlighted the money dimensions of the danger that the flood created for God's society. Enki's secret keeping of human culture through his warning to Atrahasis stood for more than simple caring. It formed a calculated strategy to keep the benefits of human service while addressing real worries about population control and cultural freedom. The gods' actions made sure that after-flood humanity would have the knowledge and skills needed to rebuild culture, while staying appropriately grateful for God stepping in their survival. This approach balanced competing interests within the god meeting, while keeping the basic connection between gods and humans. The flood's ending involved carefully planned ways that tested the amount of destruction while preparing for the restoring of normal cosmic order. Atrahasis released birds at regular times to figure out when dry land had come up enough to support renewed living. The dove's return with an olive leaf gave confirmation that plant life had begun to recover, while the raven's failure to return showed that dead bodies from the flood's victims had been scattered enough to prevent sickness outbreaks. The ark's landing on Mount Nisir, identified with modern Pir Omar Gudrun in the Zagros Mountains, positioned the flood survivors in highland territory that had stayed above the flood waters and had the supplies needed for immediate survival. This location gave access to fresh water, wild game, and materials for building temporary shelters, while the lowland areas dried enough for permanent resettling. The mountain's sacred connections in later Mesopotamian history showed its job as the birthplace of renewed human culture. Atrahasis's first act upon leaving the Ark involved building an altar and offering killings that announced humanity's survival to the god meeting. The smoke from these offerings, described as having a sweet smell, attracted the gods who had been kept from human worship throughout the flood time. The Gilgamesh account describes how the gods gathered like flies around the killing, stressing their eagerness to re-establish the money connections that human worship gave. The meeting's answer to discovering human survival created the final danger that needed solving through a new agreement between gods and humans. Enlil's starting anger at learning that his flood plan had been prevented by Enki's stepping in threatened to restart the god conflict that had caused the original danger. The gods' demand for punishment of those responsible for keeping humanity forced the meeting to address basic questions about god power and the limits of group decision-making power. E's defense of his actions before the god meeting set up patterns for god disagreement that would influence Mesopotamian religion throughout later times. The god argued that complete human destruction would have gotten rid of the worship and service that kept up god culture, creating problems for the gods themselves that outweighed any benefits from population control. His speech stressed hands-on considerations about god-human money connections, while saying yes to the rightness of worries about human freedom and cultural growth. The meeting's final resolution involved setting up new parameters for god-human connections that addressed the worries that had led to the flood, while preventing future conflicts of similar size. The gods agreed to impose natural limits on human population growth through increased infant dying, illnesses that would affect specific age groups, and social places like unmarried priesthood that would make birth rates smaller. These actions would keep able to manage population levels without needing periodic disaster steppings, in that messed up the stability of both God and human societies. The Covenant's rules about God's ability to be reached stood for another big change that addressed human cultural freedom while keeping appropriate ranking connections. The gods agreed to communicate their will through set-up channels, including fortune-telling, dreams, and prophetic inspiration, rather than through direct stepping in that had characterized earlier times. This setup kept God power while allowing human societies to develop their own places and cultural activities within parameters acceptable to their god overseers. The agreement set up between the Anunnaki and humanity, following the Great Flood, created the religious foundation for a revolutionary system of urban ruling that would define Mesopotamian culture for over 3,000 years. Rather than keeping direct watching of human business through periodic god steppings in, the gods set up permanent earthly homes within specific city-states, creating a patron god system that gave out god power across the land landscape while keeping ranking connections within the heavenly government. This spread-out approach to god ruling allowed individual Anunnaki to develop close connections with particular human communities, while keeping the group power of the god meeting for things affecting the broader cosmic order. Enlil's selection of Nippur as his main earthly home set up the model for god city patronage that other Anunnaki would follow throughout Sumer and Akkad. The god's choice showed both hands-on and religious considerations that would influence urban growth patterns across Mesopotamia. Nippur's central location within the flat land gave equal access to all major Sumerian cities, making it an ideal site for a god whose power covered the entire area. The city's height above the surrounding marshlands offered protection from seasonal flooding, while keeping access to the waterways that connected it to other urban centers through a big network of canals and rivers. The Ekkur temple group that housed Enlil's earthly home stood for the most fancy building doing of early dynastic Mesopotamia, setting up design rules that would influence religious building throughout the ancient Near East. The temple's huge ziggurat rising in 7 separate stages toward the heavens created a physical picture of the cosmic ranking that placed Enlil at the meeting point between God and human worlds. Each level of the building worked for specific ritual jobs, with priests climbing through increasingly sacred spaces as they approached the gods' private rooms at the top. Archaeological digging at Nippur has shown the big infrastructure needed to support Enlil's earthly setting up, including living areas for hundreds of priests, workshops for making ritual objects, granaries for storing farming offerings, and running offices where scribes kept detailed records of temple workings. The complex employed thousands of workers whose specialized skills kept up complex ritual cycles that made Enlil's power over both natural events and human political buildings. Craftsmen made the ceremonial weapons, jewelry, and fabrics that adorned the god's cult statue, while musicians and singers did the hymns and prayers that went along with daily worship services. The money scale of Enlil's temple workings went beyond those of any non-religious place in Mesopotamian society, with running records writing down the handling of huge farming lands, farm animal herds, and making businesses that created the wealth needed to keep up God's service. The Drehim records dating to the Ur-II time write down the delivery of over 100,000 cattle and sheep yearly to Enlil's temple for killing purposes, showing the huge scale of supplies given to keeping God's favor. These offerings came from throughout Mesopotamia as rulers from distant cities sent tribute to say yes to Enlil's highest power and look for his blessing for their political and war efforts. Enki's setting up at Eridu created a contrasting model of God's city patronage that stressed wisdom, craftwork, and the technical knowledge needed for urban culture. The god's temple group included big learning places where scribes learned the cuneiform writing system, math people developed figuring ways for building and star work, and engineers studied the water rules that enabled water system farming. These teacher activities positioned Eridu as Mesopotamia's premier center for thinking growth, attracting students from across the area who looked for training in the specialized skills that kept up urban society. The Abzu temple's unique building features showed Enki's connection with freshwater sources and his job as patron of the crafts that changed raw materials into useful products. The temple's foundation reached below ground level to create symbolic connection with the underground waters that fed Mesopotamia's rivers and canals, while its workshops made the finest examples of metal work, fabric making, and pottery making found anywhere in the ancient world. Master craftsmen working under god patronage developed innovative ways that advanced technology abilities while creating objects of extraordinary beauty and usefulness. Enki's priests kept detailed records of technical ways and scientific watching that formed Mesopotamia's earliest systematic approach to factual knowledge. Medical writings kept in the temple library wrote down surgical ways, medicine makings, and figuring out ways that stood for fancy understanding of human body structure and sicknesses. Math tablets recorded figuring methods for calculating areas, volumes, and star cycles that enabled accurate calendar keeping and building planning. These teacher doings showed how god patronage could foster thinking growth that benefited both religious and non-religious parts of human culture. Inanna's patronage of Uruk set up yet another model of god city ruling that stressed the dynamic connection between sacred and non-religious power through the place of sacred marriage. The goddess's dual nature as god of both love and war created religious tensions that needed careful handling through complex ritual cycles that channeled her potentially destroying energies toward building purposes. Her temple group, known as the Ina, had separate areas given to her contrasting parts, with priests specializing in either war or baby-making jobs depending on seasonal needs and political situations. The sacred marriage ceremony that yearly renewed Inanna's connection with the ruling king of Uruk stood for the most fancy showing of god-human political putting together achieved in Mesopotamian culture. This ritual, known as Hieros Gamos, involved the king taking on the role of Dumuzi, Inanna's story husband, in a ceremonial joining that symbolically moved god power to earthly rulership while making sure the goddess's continued support for the city's doing well and war success. The ceremony needed months of preparation, involving purification rituals, costume making ready, and practice sessions that changed the king from a human ruler into a temporary body of god power. The building setting for the sacred marriage showed the ceremony's cosmic importance through careful attention to star lineups and symbolic decoration that connected earthly events to heavenly patterns. The temple's marriage room, located at the ziggurat top, had fancy furnishings including a golden bed, precious fabrics, and ritual objects that had been blessed through early ceremonies involving the entire population of Uruk. The room's windows lined up with specific star configurations that marked the best timing for the ritual's doing, showing a fancy understanding of star cycles and their connection to farming and political activities. The money meanings of the sacred marriage reached far beyond its religious importance to include complete systems of supply giving out and social organizing that put together god worship with hands-on ruling. The ceremony's successful finishing made sure Inanna's blessing for the coming farming year, with the goddess's favor appearing through plenty of harvests, successful war campaigns, and doing well in trade connections with neighboring cities. On the other hand, any messing up of the ritual cycle could result in god displeasure shown through crop failures, war losses, or money shakiness that threatened the city's survival. Nanna's patronage of created the most money-fancy temple running in Mesopotamian history, with the moon god's priests developing innovative money tools and business activities that helped long-distance trade throughout the ancient world. The god's connection with time measuring positioned his temple as the power-having source for calendar figurines that coordinated farming, business, and religious activities across many city-states. Merchants throughout Mesopotamia synchronized their trading trips with moon cycles figured by Nanna's priests, while farmers planned planting and harvesting schedules according to calendars given out from the temple group. The ziggurat of Nanna at known as the Ekishnugel, had fancy star-watching places that enabled exact tracking of moon phases and planet movements needed for keeping calendar rightness. The temple's records keep thousands of math tablets writing down complex figurines needed to reconcile moon months with sun years, a figuring challenge that needed advanced understanding of fractional math and algebraic connections. These math doings stood for some of the most fancy thinking work made in the ancient world, showing how religious needs could drive technology innovation that benefited broader society. The priesthood rankings that developed within each city's patron temple showed the specialized knowledge and running skills needed to keep God's service while handling huge money businesses. At Nippur, Enlil's high priest, known as the worked as the god's main earthly representative with power over religious, political, and money business that affected the entire Sumerian joining together. This position needed mastery of religious teaching, legal earlier example, and running ways that enabled effective coordinating between God will and human needs across many areas of activity. Lower priestly ranks included the Sangha, who watched over daily temple workings and handled the big workforce needed for ritual doing and money-making. These middle-level runners had specialized knowledge of prayer needs, accounting ways, and craft ways that enabled them to coordinate complex activities involving hundreds of workers and huge supply flows. The Mashmashu priests specialized in ritual purification and exorcism, keeping the spiritual cleanliness needed for effective God talking, while the Kalu priests did the musical prayers that went along with killing offerings and seasonal celebrations. The training needed for priestly service involved decades of study in temple schools where students mastered cuneiform reading-writing, math figuring, star watching, and religious teaching needed for effective temple running. The what is taught included extensive memorizing of hymns, prayers, and ritual ways that kept traditional activities while allowing for changing situations. Advanced students specialized in particular parts of temple workings, developing know-how in areas such as fortune-telling, medical activities, or business law that enabled them to serve both religious and non-religious jobs within their communities. Women played crucial jobs within temple rankings, particularly in places given to goddesses like Inanna, where female priests known as Entu worked as the deity's main earthly representatives. These high-ranking priestesses had power comparable to their male counterparts, watching over big temple workings while keeping the ritual purity needed for effective God talking. The Entu of Inanna at Uruk held duty for the sacred marriage ceremony, working as the goddess's earthly form during the king's symbolic joining with God power. The Natatu priestesses written about extensively in old Babylonian records stood for another group of female religious specialists who combined spiritual service with business activities that created substantial income for temple places. These women, who stayed unmarried throughout their careers, handled farming lands, engaged in money-lending workings, and coordinated trade connections that connected temple money with broader business networks. Their business activities needed a fancy understanding of deal law, market conditions, and money tools that positioned them among the most money-knowledgeable individuals in Mesopotamian society. Temple building changed to accommodate the complex ritual needs and running jobs that characterized mature Anunnaki worship, with one after another building phases creating increasingly fancy groups that ruled their urban environments. The standard temple layout included a central place housing the deity's cult statue surrounded by rooms for storing ritual tools, making ready offerings, and housing priests. Courtyards gave space for large-scale ceremonies involving entire urban populations, while running wings had records, workshops, and living areas needed for temple workings. The technology fanciness of temple building showed both religious needs and hands-on considerations about building stability and environment changing. Builders developed innovative ways for creating waterproof foundations in marshy land, building earthquake-standing walls able to support huge top buildings, and designing drainage systems that prevented flood damage to sacred areas. The use of fired brick rather than sun-dried mud brick for temple building showed the enormous supplies given to creating permanent god homes that would last across many generations. Ritual activities within Anunnaki temples followed carefully prescribed ways that kept God favor while giving meaningful religious experiences for human people taking part. Daily services included morning and evening offerings of food, drink, and incense that kept up the deity's earthly home, gone along with musical doings and prayer sayings that honored God features and asked for continued blessing. The god's cult statue got personal care, including washing, clothing changes, and giving of meals that treated the god image as a living presence needing constant attention. Seasonal festivals created opportunities for entire urban populations to take part in god worship through processions, communal meals, and ritual doings that made stronger social unity while honoring patron gods. The Eridu New Year celebration involved complex ceremonies that symbolically renewed god kingship and cosmic order, with the patron deity's statue traveling throughout the city to get homage from all social classes. These public rituals showed God approval for existing political setups, while giving opportunities for rulers to display their devotion and generosity through magnificent offerings and entertainment for their subjects. The putting together of God worship with hands-on ruling created temple places that worked as complete running centers handling legal arguments, business transactions, and social services that affected entire urban populations. Temple courts settled conflicts involving deal violations, property arguments, and family law things, with priests working as judges whose choices carried God power. These legal jobs positioned temples as needed places for keeping social order, while making sure that human actions conformed to God moral standards. The political rise of Babylon during the early 2nd thousand-year period BCE fundamentally changed Anunnaki religion through the systematic raising of Marduk, from a relatively minor god to the highest king of the gods. This religious revolution, written most completely in the Enuma Elish creation story, stood for far more than simple religious propaganda supporting Babylonian political ambitions. The restructuring of god ranking needed fancy religious arguments that kept the power of set-up Anunnaki, while accommodating Marduk's never-before rise to cosmic highest position. Marduk's family credentials as Enki's son gave the needed foundation for his claim to highest power within existing Anunnaki buildings. Babylonian religious teachers stressed his inheritance of his father's wisdom and technical know-how, while adding war prowess that made him different from the thoughtful Enki. The god's youth stood for an advantage rather than a liability in facing ancient chaos forces that threatened set-up cosmic order, as older gods like Anu and Enlil had proven not good enough to the challenge posed by Tiamat's fighting back. The Enuma Elish's account of Marduk's rise to power through combat with Tiamat set up earlier examples for god power based on shown ability rather than traditional inheritance or being older. The story describes how the set-up gods, faced with Tiamat's threat to destroy the younger generation of gods, offered highest kingship to any god able to beat the ancient chaos monster. Marduk's acceptance of this challenge, dependent on getting permanent power over all god choices, created a deal basis for his highest position that satisfied legal needs while saying yes to his exceptional qualifications. The weapons and powers that Marduk put together for his confrontation with Tiamat showed Babylonian understanding of the technology and organizing abilities needed for effective ruling. The god's bow, described as creating lightning when drawn, stood for mastery over air events before connected with Enlil's power. His net, woven from the four winds, showed control over directional forces that enabled complete war strategy. The hurricane that filled his body gave the raw power needed to overwhelm opposition, while his chariot, drawn by 4 horses, enabled rapid movement across cosmic battlefields. Marduk's tactical approach to beating Tiamat showed fancy war thinking that would influence Babylonian strategic teaching throughout later times. Rather than engaging in direct frontal assault, the god used deception and higher technology to neutralize his opponent's advantages. His inflating of Tiamat through forced swallowing of wind made her vulnerable to internal attack, while his net prevented her escape once the battle began. The exact shot that split her body in half showed gun skills that needed extensive training and natural talent. The cosmic reorganizing that followed Marduk's winning set up new rules of god running that centralized power while keeping a job specializing among lower gods. The god's division of Tiamat's dead body to create heaven and earth positioned him as the highest architect of the physical universe, while his choosing of other Anunnaki to specific running jobs kept their worth within the new ranking. This reorganizing balanced revolutionary change with conservative keeping of existing places, enabling smooth transition to Babylonian religious highest position. The 50 names of Marduk said at the Enuma Elish's ending gave complete religious reason for the god's absorption of powers and features before being given out among many Anunnaki. Each name stood for specific parts of god power that Marduk had gotten through his winning over chaos, creating a systematic religion that explained how one god could effectively control jobs before needing an entire group of gods. This combining showed Babylonian running preferences for centralized power, while saying yes to the complexity of cosmic ruling. Babylonian temple building changed to accommodate Marduk's highest status through building of increasingly magnificent places that went beyond earlier Sumerian religious groups in scale and fanciness. The Esagila temple group in Babylon had a ziggurat known as Enki reaching approximately 90 meters in height and visible from distances of several kilometers across the Mesopotamian flat land. This building's huge scale needed engineering innovations that pushed contemporary building ways to their limits, while creating a physical showing of Marduk's cosmic power. The Ishtar Gate, working as the ceremonial entrance to Babylon's sacred area, showed the artistic and technological doings that Marduk's patronage enabled. The gate's brilliant blue glazed brick surface, decorated with relief sculptures of dragons and bulls standing for Marduk and connected gods, created visual impact that made stronger religious messages about god power and royal power. The processional way leading to the gate had similar decorative programs that changed routine religious processions into spectacular displays of god and earthly magnificence. The Akitu festival, celebrated yearly in Babylon, stood for the most complex religious ceremony developed in Mesopotamian culture, needing 11 days of complex rituals that renewed both god kingship and earthly royal power. The festival's centerpiece involved Marduk's symbolic acting out again of his winning over Tiamat through ritual combat done by priests wearing appropriate costumes and masks. This ceremony made stronger religious teachings about cosmic order while giving spectacular entertainment that attracted visitors from throughout the known world. The humiliation ritual done by the Babylonian king during a kiddu showed the fancy balance between god and royal power that characterized mature Mesopotamian political religion. The high priest's removal of royal symbols and physical striking of the king symbolized the temporary suspension of earthly power while god power went through renewal. The king's declaration of innocence about temple maintenance, urban doing well, and war protection gave public accountability for royal doing, while saying yes to final dependence on god favor. Assyrian changing of Anunnaki mythology showed the war empire's distinctive political needs and cultural preferences, while keeping needed religious continuities with earlier Mesopotamian stories. The raising of Ashur from local city god to highest national god matched Marduk's rise in Babylonian religion, but stressed war parts of god power that supported Assyrian empire thinking. Ashur's identification with the Assyrian state itself created a never-before fusion of religious and political identity that made Assyrian culture different from its Mesopotamian ones that came before. The religious putting together of Ashur within the existing Anunnaki ranking needed careful negotiating of competing claims to the highest power that might have created conflicts with set-up Babylonian religious teaching. Assyrian religious teachers solved this potential problem by stressing Ashur's job as war commander of the god meeting rather than replacing Marduk's cosmic kingship entirely. This setup kept diplomatic connections with Babylonian religious places, while asserting Assyrian political highest position through god war leadership. Assyrian royal writings always showed war campaigns as religious wars fought on behalf of Ashur and the Anunnaki against foreign gods who threatened cosmic order. Sargon II's records describe his conquest of Urartu as punishment for that kingdom's neglect of proper god worship, while Sennacherib's siege of Jerusalem stood for Ashur's judgment against Hezekiah's religious changes that had gotten rid of Assyrian cult installations. These religious readings changed political conflicts into cosmic struggles between order and chaos that justified extreme war actions against resistant populations. The Assyrian royal library at Nineveh, put together primarily during Ashurbanipal's reign in the 7th century BCE, kept the most complete collection of Anunnaki literature ever put together in the ancient world. The library's systematic getting program gathered writings from temples and scribal schools throughout Mesopotamia, creating a teacher resource that enabled comparison study of different area stories about god mythology and ritual activities. This thinking project showed Assyrian commitment to keeping Mesopotamian cultural heritage while changing it to empire needs. The making the same of Anunnaki mythology achieved through Ashurbanipal's library project created power-having forms of major pieces that influenced later transmission of Mesopotamian religious literature. Scribes working under royal patronage made carefully edited copies of stories, hymns, and ritual writings that reconciled different readings while keeping needed religious content. These made the same writings became the basis for later Neo-Babylonian and Persian time copies that transmitted Mesopotamian religious stories to later cultures. Neo-Babylonian revival movements during the 6th century BCE stood for conscious attempts to restore authentic Mesopotamian religious stories that had been changed or ignored during times of foreign control. Nebuchadnezzar's huge building projects in Babylon included complete rebuilding of major temples according to ancient building rules kept in cuneiform records. These restoring efforts needed extensive archaeological investigating of earlier building phases and consulting with traditional writings that wrote down proper ritual ways and building specifications. The teacher activities sponsored by Neo-Babylonian rulers created never-before opportunities for systematic study of Anunnaki stories through comparison of writings from different times and areas. Priests working in temple libraries developed fancy language ways for analyzing different readings and reconstructing damaged parts in ancient pieces. Their commentaries on classical writings kept interpretive stories that explained unclear references and gave religious context for understanding complex stories. Nabu's rising to never-before prominence during the Neo-Babylonian time showed the thinking character of this cultural revival and the importance of teacher activity in keeping traditional religious knowledge. As patron god of writing and wisdom, Nabu's cult attracted scribes and teachers whose work kept continuity with earlier Mesopotamian thinking stories while changing them to contemporary needs. The god's temple at Borsippa became a major center for copying and studying ancient writings, with its library rivaling Ashurbanipal's collection in scope and teacher fanciness. The putting together of foreign gods into traditional Anunnaki systems during times of cultural exchange showed the flexibility and changeability that enabled Mesopotamian religious stories to survive political upsets and population changes. Persian time writings from Babylon show how Ahura Mazda and other Zoroastrian gods were put into existing god rankings through identification with set-up Anunnaki, or giving specialized jobs that went well with traditional jobs. This religious accommodation enabled Persian runners to keep rightness while respecting local religious feelings. Greek influence during the Seleucid time created more challenges and opportunities for Anunnaki religious growth, as Mesopotamian teachers met Hellenistic philosophical ideas and stories. The identification of Marduk with Zeus and Nabu with Apollo showed systematic attempts to create religious bridges between different cultural stories while keeping needed Mesopotamian religious content. These blended growths influenced both Greek understanding of Near Eastern religion and Mesopotamian changing to Hellenistic cultural contexts. The star interests that characterized late Mesopotamian teaching created new interpretive systems for understanding Anunnaki mythology through heavenly watchings and math study. Babylonian star watchers identified individual gods with specific stars and planet movements, creating systematic matchings between stories and watchable heavenly events. These scientific approaches to religious reading influenced both native religious growth and the transmission of Mesopotamian star knowledge to Greek and later Islamic teachers. The persistence of Anunnaki worship into the Parthian and Sasanian times showed the deep cultural roots that these religious stories had developed throughout 3,000 years of continuous activities. Archaeological proof from sites like Babylon and Uruk shows continued temple keeping and ritual activity well into the Common Era, with cuneiform writings writing down traditional ceremonies done for increasingly small communities of practitioners. These late showings of ancient stories kept needed religious ideas that would influence later religious growths in the area. The slow changing of Anunnaki ideas into folk stories and magical activities showed the changing of fancy religious systems to changing social and political situations that no longer supported complex temple places. Magic writings from the early Islamic time show how individual Anunnaki continued to be called upon for protection and help in personal things, though their cosmic power had been replaced by one-god religious systems. These survivals show the enduring appeal of Mesopotamian religious ideas and their influence on later cultural growths throughout the Near East and beyond. Alexander the Great's conquest of Babylon in 331 BCE marked the beginning of a deep change in Anunnaki worship that would fundamentally change the character of Mesopotamian religious activities over the following centuries. The Macedonian kings starting respect for local religious stories, shown through his taking part in traditional Babylonian coronation ceremonies and his orders to restore damaged temples, created a misleading continuity that masked the deeper cultural changes his conquest would unleash. The young conqueror's death in Babylon 8 years later, possibly in the very palace where Nebuchadnezzar had once ruled, symbolically marked the end of purely Mesopotamian control over the religious stories that had shaped the area for 3,000 years. The Seleucid family's setting up of Greek running systems throughout their huge empire created never-before challenges for traditional Anunnaki worship, as Hellenistic government buildings worked according to fundamentally different rules than the temple-centered ruling that had characterized earlier Mesopotamian culture. Greek runners trained in philosophical stories that stressed rational inquiry and systematic putting into categories, approached religious events as subjects for thinking study rather than objects of devotional activities. This studying viewpoint, while not necessarily hostile to local stories, created thinking systems that slowly changed how educated populations understood God power and cosmic order. The foundation of Seleucia on the Tigris as a new running capital deliberately positioned Greek colonial power alongside rather than within existing Mesopotamian urban centers, creating parallel power buildings that competed for supplies and population. The new city's Greek theater, gymnasium, and agora gave other social places that attracted ambitious Mesopotamians looking for advancement within Hellenistic running rankings. These non-religious civic spaces offered cultural experiences that rivaled traditional temple festivals in their ability to create community identity and social unity, slowly making less the exclusive power that religious places had before used over urban life. The thinking excitement created by contact between Greek philosophical stories and Mesopotamian religious teaching made remarkable blended growths that kept needed Anunnaki ideas while changing them to Hellenistic cultural contexts. Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing in Greek during the early 3rd century BCE, created the most complete try to present Mesopotamian religious stories to Greek audiences through his Babyloniaca, a 3-volume work that changed cuneiform stories into Greek literary forms while keeping their needed religious content. His account of the Anunnaki as god beings who came down from heaven to teach humanity the arts of culture resonated with Greek stories about culture heroes and god benefactors, creating thinking bridges between different story systems. The identification of individual Anunnaki with Greek gods stood for a systematic religious project that needed careful study of god features and jobs to set up meaningful connections between different religious stories. Marduk's identification with Zeus showed obvious parallels in their jobs as highest kings of their respective groups of gods, while both gods' connections with storm events and royal power gave more points of connection. However, this identification also changed understanding of Marduk's character by stressing his job as cosmic ruler, while making less important the complex religious connections with other Anunnaki that had characterized traditional Babylonian religious thought. Nabu's equating with Apollo created particularly productive blended possibilities, as both gods controlled thinking activities including writing, prophesying, and artistic inspiration. The Greek god's connection with the Delphic oracle gave a familiar system for understanding Nabu's job in fortune-telling, while his patronage of poetry and music resonated with the Mesopotamian god's connection to teacher and scribal activities. Hellenistic time writings from Babylon show how this identification enabled Greek-educated Mesopotamians to take part in both cultural stories at the same time, calling upon Apollo Nabu in contexts that needed both Greek literary fanciness and traditional Mesopotamian religious power. The blended growths that came up in multicultural Hellenistic cities created never-before religious innovations that combined Anunnaki religion with Greek philosophical ideas and Egyptian magical activities. The city of Dura-Europos on the Euphrates, founded by Seleucus I around 300 BCE, gives archaeological proof for this religious creativity through temple groups that housed many stories within shared building spaces. The site's Mesopotamian temple had traditional Babylonian religious art alongside Greek-style sculptures and writings, while ritual deposits included objects showing Egyptian, Persian, and Arabian religious influences. The changing of Anunnaki worship in Hellenistic urban contexts involved big changes in ritual activities that showed new social realities and cultural preferences. Traditional temple festivals that had before involved entire urban populations became more specialized events that attracted primarily those families keeping ancestral connections to Mesopotamian religious stories. The fancy processions and public ceremonies that had once shown god power to mixed populations were replaced by more close gatherings that stressed community identity and cultural keeping, rather than cosmic ruling. The job of Babylonian star watchers in keeping Anunnaki stories became crucial during this time of cultural transition, as their scientific know-how gave them unique power that went beyond political and religious borders. The star diaries kept by temple teachers wrote down heavenly watchings with never-before exactness, while keeping traditional connections between planet movements and god activities. These scientific records enabled Babylonian star watchers to keep their professional status within Hellenistic thinking circles, while continuing to work for traditional religious jobs within their local communities. The math fanciness achieved by Babylonian star watchers during the Seleucid time stood for the peak of thousands of years of teacher growth that had been fostered by temple places given to Anunnaki worship. The growth of fancy predictive models for planet motion needed figuring ways that went beyond contemporary Greek math abilities, earning them knowledge throughout the Hellenistic world as the top authorities on heavenly events. This scientific reputation enabled them to keep and transmit traditional story readings of star events to audiences that might otherwise have dismissed Mesopotamian religious ideas as primitive superstition. The Babylonian star watcher Kidinu, working during the 4th century BCE, stood for this blend of scientific rigor with traditional religious knowledge through his growth of math models that could predict moon eclipses with remarkable rightness, while keeping traditional readings of these events as showings of god displeasure or cosmic conflict. His figuring methods, kept in cuneiform math writings, influenced both Hellenistic star theory and traditional Mesopotamian fortune-telling activities, showing how scientific innovation could serve both non-religious and religious purposes at the same time. The slow changing of Anunnaki from active gods controlling cosmic business to star and magical figures showed broader cultural changes that made less the political power of traditional religious places while keeping their specialized knowledge for private consulting. Hellenistic time magical papyri from Egypt have numerous callings of Mesopotamian gods, but these writings treat the Anunnaki as powerful spirits available for individual magical control rather than as cosmic rulers whose power shaped political and natural events. This changing kept the names and basic features of traditional gods while fundamentally changing their religious importance and social job. The growth of personal horoscopic star study during the Hellenistic time created new contexts for Anunnaki influence that stressed individual fate rather than group cosmic ruling. Babylonian star watchers changed their traditional knowledge of planet-god connections to create personalized predictions based on birth dates and heavenly configurations, changing cosmic religion into hands-on guidance for private choosing. This individualizing of God influence showed broader Hellenistic cultural trends that stressed personal doing and private religious experience over communal identity and public ritual watching. The magical stories that came up from this change treated individual Anunnaki as specialized supernatural agents, whose powers could be accessed through appropriate ritual ways and prayers. Marduk's power over cosmic order made him particularly valuable for magical activities designed to impose control over chaotic situations, while Enki's connection with wisdom and technical knowledge attracted practitioners looking for solutions to complex hands-on problems. These magical uses kept detailed knowledge of traditional god features, while changing them to serve individual rather than communal needs. The persistence of cuneiform reading-writing among specialized teacher communities enabled the continued copying and study of traditional Anunnaki writings long after Aramaic and Greek had become the ruling languages for most running and business purposes. The latest datable cuneiform tablets from Babylon, made during the 1st century CE, include copies of classical story pieces alongside star and math writings, showing that traditional religious literature continued to be valued by teacher communities even as its broader social relevance went down. The influence of Mesopotamian star and star study knowledge on Hellenistic thinking culture created indirect channels through which Anunnaki ideas reached Mediterranean audiences that had no direct contact with Mesopotamian religious stories. Greek star writings put in Babylonian figuring methods and watching data, while often keeping traditional god names for planet bodies and star configurations. This scientific transmission made sure that Anunnaki naming and basic story connections would influence Western star and star study stories for centuries after the collapse of Mesopotamian temple places. The Jewish communities that stayed in Mesopotamia following the Babylonian exile developed complex connections with traditional Anunnaki worship that involved both saying no to polytheistic religion and changing of Mesopotamian religious ideas to one-god systems. The Book of Daniel's references to Babylonian religious activities show detailed knowledge of temple rituals and god rankings, while apocalyptic literature from this time shows clear influence from Mesopotamian stories about cosmic conflict and god judgment. These changings kept needed structural elements of Anunnaki religion while changing their religious importance to conform with Jewish one-god needs. The Parthian conquest of Mesopotamia during the 2nd century BCE created new political contexts that were more favorable to traditional religious activities than Hellenistic rule had been, as Parthian running policies generally respected local cultural freedom while needing only political loyalty to empire power. Archaeological proof from Babylonian temple sites shows renewed building activity and ritual innovation during the early Parthian time, suggesting that reduced Greek cultural pressure enabled partial revival of traditional religious places. However, these revivals worked within fundamentally changed social contexts that limited their scope and influence compared to earlier times of Mesopotamian freedom. The coming up of Mandean religious communities in southern Mesopotamia during the late Hellenistic or early Parthian time kept big elements of traditional Anunnaki mythology within Gnostic religious systems that stressed secret knowledge and spiritual salvation. Mandean writings have detailed cosmological stories that show clear connections to earlier Mesopotamian creation myths, while their ritual activities keep ways and word meanings that come from traditional temple prayers. These religious growths show how ancient religious ideas could be changed to serve new spiritual needs, while keeping needed continuity with earlier stories. The influence of Zoroastrian religious ideas on late Mesopotamian religious growth created more blended possibilities that combined Anunnaki religion with Persian dualistic cosmology and end times expectations. Writings from the Sasanian time show how traditional Mesopotamian gods were put into Zoroastrian cosmic rankings as Yazatas or god beings serving Ahura Mazda's cosmic power. This religious accommodation enabled continued respect for traditional gods within systems that satisfied Persian religious needs, while keeping needed elements of Mesopotamian religious identity. The changing of Anunnaki worship during the Hellenistic era stood for more than simple going down or cultural blending. It involved creative changing of ancient religious stories to new social and thinking contexts that kept needed religious insights while enabling continued cultural relevance. The scientific doings of Babylonian star watchers, the blended religious growths in multicultural cities, and the keeping of traditional knowledge through specialized teacher communities, all helped to making sure that Mesopotamian religious ideas would continue to influence later cultural growths long after the collapse of the political and social places that had originally kept them up. The slow ending of traditional Mesopotamian temple places during the early centuries of the Common Era didn't mark the complete disappearance of Anunnaki stories from the thinking landscape of the ancient world. Instead, these religious and story ideas went through a complex way of keeping and changing through networks of teachers, translators, and religious communities that kept pieces of ancient wisdom within new cultural and language contexts. The transmission of Mesopotamian knowledge during late old times happened through many channels that often worked independently of each other, creating a diverse collection of sources that keep different parts of Anunnaki stories according to their specific thinking interests and cultural needs. The Syriac Christian communities that came up in northern Mesopotamia during the 3rd and 4th centuries CE played a crucial job in keeping star and math knowledge that had originally developed within Anunnaki temple groups. These teachers, working primarily in Edessa, Nisibis, and other centers of Syriac learning, changed Greek star writings that put in Babylonian figuring methods, while also keeping direct access to cuneiform sources through bilingual teachers who could still read the ancient script. The Syriac translation of Ptolemy's Almagest, finished during the 6th century, kept Babylonian star lists and planet theories that had traditional god names and story connections, making sure that Anunnaki naming would continue to influence star word meanings throughout the medieval time. The teacher activities of figures like Severus Sebakhat, working in the monastery of Kenishir during the 7th century, showed how Syriac thinking people kept fancy understanding of Mesopotamian math and star stories long after the collapse of the place buildings that had originally kept them up. Sebakhat's treatise on the astrolabe included detailed talks of Babylonian figuring methods for calculating planet positions, while his math works kept number ways that came finally from cuneiform math writings. His famous reference to Indian numerals as higher than Greek systems showed comparing study that drew on many math stories, including Mesopotamian methods that he accessed through both Greek and Syriac sources. The Mandean religious communities of southern Mesopotamia kept perhaps the most direct continuity with ancient Anunnaki stories through their keeping of ritual activities and stories that showed clear connections to earlier Mesopotamian religious writings. The Mandean creation account kept in the Ginza Rabbah has cosmological stories that parallel Mesopotamian creation myths, including references to ancient waters, god meetings, and the creation of humanity for God's service. The writing's description of the Uthra, god beings who controlled different parts of the cosmos, shows clear structural similarities to Anunnaki rankings, while changing these ideas to serve Mandean religious needs, stressing spiritual salvation and secret knowledge. Mandean ritual activities keep technical word meanings and procedural details that came from ancient Mesopotamian temple prayers, though changed to serve different religious purposes. The Masakta ceremony, done to make sure the spiritual rise of deceased souls, involved ritual ways that paralleled ancient Mesopotamian funerary practices, while putting in elements that showed later Gnostic influences. The priest's use of specific prayers and ritual gestures during these ceremonies kept traditional ways for God talking that had originally developed within Anunnaki temple groups, showing remarkable continuity across more than 1,000 years of cultural and political change. The keeping of Mesopotamian star knowledge within Islamic teacher circles stood for another crucial channel through which Anunnaki-related ideas reached medieval audiences. The translation movement that flourished in Baghdad during the 8th and 9th centuries CE brought together teachers from diverse cultural backgrounds who worked together to translate Greek, Persian, and Sanskrit scientific writings into Arabic, while also accessing native Mesopotamian sources that had survived in different forms. The Banu Musa brothers, working under Abbasid patronage during the 9th century, made translations of star works that kept Babylonian star names and constellation mythology, making sure that traditional Anunnaki connections with heavenly events would continue to influence Islamic star writings. The great star watcher al-Battani, working in northern Mesopotamia during the late 9th and early 10th centuries, stood for the fancy blend of diverse star stories that characterized Islamic scientific culture. His Zij al-Sabai had star lists that kept Babylonian star naming alongside Greek constellation names and Arabic watching data, creating complete reference works that kept continuity with ancient stories while advancing contemporary scientific knowledge. His figuring methods for calculating planet positions put in ways that finally came from Babylonian math star study, though changed and made better through centuries of teacher growth. The Haranian community at ancient Kari stood for a remarkable example of direct religious continuity with ancient Mesopotamian stories, keeping temple worship and philosophical schools that kept elements of traditional planet religion well into the Islamic time. These teachers, who identified themselves as Sabians to gain knowledge as a right religious community under Islamic law, kept fancy star and math knowledge that they claimed came from ancient Mesopotamian wisdom stories. Their temple group, housed libraries having writings in many languages that kept traditional knowledge about planet influences and god rankings, though changed to conform with one god needs imposed by Islamic political power. The influence of Haranian teachers on medieval Islamic thinking culture reached far beyond their small religious community through their jobs as translators, star watchers, and court advisors who brought ancient Mesopotamian knowledge into contact with contemporary scientific and philosophical growth. Thabit ibn Qurra, the most famous Haranian teacher of the 9th century, made translations of math and star writings that kept traditional figuring methods while also giving original research that advanced contemporary understanding of planet motion and math theory. His work on the precession of equinoxes put in watching data that came finally from Babylonian star records, showing how ancient knowledge could help contemporary scientific advancement. The keeping of Mesopotamian medical knowledge within Islamic teacher circles created another channel through which traditional wisdom connected with Anunnaki temple medicine reached medieval audiences. The translation of Greek medical writings that put in earlier Mesopotamian medicine knowledge made sure that traditional remedies and figuring out ways would continue to influence medical activities throughout the Islamic world. The works of Hunayn ibn Ishaq and other translators kept detailed knowledge of plant-based medicines and surgical ways that had originally developed within temple medical schools, though changed to serve the needs of Islamic urban populations rather than traditional religious communities. The magical and star study stories that came up within medieval Islamic culture put in big elements from ancient Mesopotamian religious activities, though changed to serve individual rather than communal purposes. The Gayat al-Hakim credited to the Cordoban teacher Maslama al-Madridi had detailed directions for calling planet spirits that showed clear connections to traditional Anunnaki worship, including specific ritual ways and prayers that kept ancient word meanings and symbolic connections. These magical writings treated traditional gods as powerful spiritual entities that could be contacted through appropriate ritual ways, keeping needed elements of ancient religious activities while changing them to serve private rather than public purposes. The influence of Mesopotamian star study stories on medieval Islamic and Christian cultures worked through many channels that kept different parts of traditional knowledge according to their specific cultural needs. The Kitab al-Uluf by Abu Mashar al-Balkhi included extensive material from Babylonian star study sources, including detailed descriptions of planet influences and predictive ways that kept traditional connections between heavenly events and earthly events. His work influenced both Islamic and Latin star study stories, making sure that Mesopotamian ideas would continue to shape medieval understanding of cosmic influences on human business. The transmission of Mesopotamian flood stories through Jewish and Christian literary stories created more channels through which Anunnaki-related ideas reached medieval audiences, though significantly changed to conform with one god religious needs. The Book of Enoch, written during the Second Temple time but kept in different medieval manuscripts, had detailed accounts of god beings who came down to earth and taught humanity different arts and sciences, clearly showing influence from traditional Anunnaki mythology while changing these stories to serve Jewish apocalyptic religion. The writing's description of the Watchers and their interactions with humanity kept structural elements of ancient Mesopotamian god-human connections while changing their religious importance. Medieval Christian chronographic stories kept pieces of Mesopotamian historical and stories through their putting in of material from Berossus and other Hellenistic sources that had tried to present Babylonian stories to Greek audiences. The Chronicle of Michael the Syrian, written during the 12th century, had references to rulers before the flood and god beings that showed traditional Mesopotamian king lists and stories, though read within Christian religious systems that stressed God providence and human salvation. These chronographic works kept traditional chronological data and story buildings while changing them to serve Christian historical and religious purposes. The influence of Mesopotamian building and artistic stories on medieval Islamic religious and non-religious buildings created visual channels through which traditional symbolic connections continued to influence cultural showing. The use of step tower designs in medieval Islamic building showed influence from ancient ziggurat building, while decorative programs that put in star and star-study imagery kept traditional connections between building space and cosmic order. The Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, built during the late 7th century, had decorative elements that showed clear influence from earlier Mesopotamian artistic stories, including geometric patterns and heavenly imagery that kept traditional symbolic connections while serving new religious purposes. The keeping of Mesopotamian math knowledge within medieval Islamic teacher circles made sure that figuring ways originally developed for temple running and star figuring would continue to influence scientific and business activities throughout the medieval time. The works of Al-Khwarizmi and other early Islamic math people put in methods that came finally from Babylonian math writings, including fancy ways for solving quadratic equations and calculating compound interest that had originally developed to serve temple money running. These math stories kept continuity with ancient teacher activities while changing them to serve the needs of medieval Islamic urban culture. The influence of Mesopotamian legal stories on medieval Islamic law worked through complex channels that kept certain procedural and thinking elements while changing their religious and social importance. The growth of Islamic business law put in rules that showed clear connections to earlier Mesopotamian legal stories, including fancy approaches to deal formation, argument solving, and business partnership that had originally developed within temple-centered money systems. These legal stories kept hands-on continuity with ancient business activities, while changing them to serve the needs of medieval Islamic trading networks. The mystical stories that came up within medieval Islamic culture put in elements that showed clear connections to earlier Mesopotamian religious activities, particularly in their approaches to God talking and spiritual change. The works of Sufi authors like Ibn Arabi had cosmological ideas that showed influence from traditional Mesopotamian religious ideas, including detailed descriptions of God rankings and cosmic building that kept needed elements of ancient religious thought while changing them to serve Islamic mystical purposes. These mystical stories kept continuity with ancient approaches to God knowledge while changing their hands-on and religious uses. The keeping of Mesopotamian farming and technical knowledge within medieval Islamic culture made sure that hands-on wisdom originally developed within temple-centered money systems would continue to influence rural and urban life throughout the medieval time. Farming guides made by Islamic teachers put in ways for water system handling, crop rotation, and farm animal breeding that came finally from Mesopotamian farming stories, though changed to serve different environments and social conditions. These technical stories kept hands-on continuity with ancient knowledge while showing their continued relevance for medieval farming and urban growth. The influence of Mesopotamian musical and prayer stories on medieval religious activities created more channels through which ancient cultural elements reached contemporary audiences, though significantly changed to serve new religious and social purposes. The growth of Islamic prayer music put in modal systems and ways that showed connections to earlier Mesopotamian temple music, while Christian prayer stories in the area kept certain melodic and rhythmic patterns that showed continuity with ancient religious activities. These musical stories kept aesthetic and hands-on continuity with ancient cultural forms while changing them to serve medieval religious and social needs. The systematic recovery of Anunnaki source materials began with the monumental breakthrough achieved by Georg Friedrich Grotefend in 1802, when the German language expert successfully figured out the first cuneiform characters from Old Persian writings at Persepolis. Working with copies of three language writings that included Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian forms of the same royal announcements, Grotefend applied comparing language methods to identify repeating royal names and titles, setting up the foundation for all later cuneiform studies. His starting success with Old Persian gave the key to unlocking Akkadian, and in the end Sumerian, opening access to the huge body of Mesopotamian literature that had stayed silent for over 1,000 years. The figuring out way speeded up dramatically through the competitive efforts of Henry Rawlinson, who spent years hanging on ropes copying the huge three-language writing of Darius I carved into the cliff face at Behistun in western Iran. Rawlinson's careful work during the 1840s gave teachers with extensive two-language writings that enabled systematic comparison between known Old Persian words and their Akkadian matches. His publication of accurate copies of the Behistun writing in 1851 gave European teachers the extensive parallel writings needed for setting up grammar rules and vocabulary lists that would make possible the reading of one-language Akkadian and Sumerian writings. The British Museum's getting of Austin Henry Layard's discoveries from Nineveh changed European understanding of ancient Mesopotamian culture and gave the first substantial collection of cuneiform tablets having story and religious writings. Layard's digging at Kyanjik, the site of ancient Nineveh, between 1845 and 1851, uncovered the palace library of Ashurbanipal, having over 30,000 cuneiform tablets and pieces that stood for the most complete collection of Mesopotamian literature ever put together in old times. The library's systematic organizing, with writings arranged by subject matter and cross-referenced through detailed lists, gave modern teachers never-before access to the full range of Mesopotamian thinking. George Smith's dramatic announcement in 1872 that he had discovered an account of the biblical flood among the Nineveh tablets created international sensation and showed the immediate relevance of cuneiform studies for understanding ancient history and religious stories. Smith's identification of the flood story within what would later be recognized as the Epic of Gilgamesh marked the first recovery of a complete Anunnaki-related story piece, giving solid proof for the fancy religious and literary stories that had developed in ancient Mesopotamia. His public lecture to the Society of Biblical Archaeology drew overflow crowds and newspaper coverage that brought cuneiform teaching to popular attention for the first time. The later identification of many flood accounts, including the more complete form kept in the Atrahasis story, showed the central importance of God judgment stories within Mesopotamian religious thought and gave teachers with detailed information about Anunnaki religion and cosmic ruling. Smith's continued work on the Nineveh tablets yielded more story pieces, including creation accounts and god family trees that explained the complex connections between different members of the Anunnaki group. His early death in 1876, while searching for more flood tablet pieces in Syria, stood for a big loss to the emerging field of Assyriology. But his discoveries had already set up the basic importance of Mesopotamian literature for understanding ancient religious and cultural growth. The German digging at Babylon, started by Robert Koldewey in 1899 and continued for 18 years, gave the first systematic archaeological investigation of a major Mesopotamian religious center and yielded big building and writing proof for Anunnaki worship activities. Koldewey's careful writing down of the Ishtar Gate, the processional way, and the foundations of the great ziggurat Enki showed the huge scale of supplies given to God service and the fancy engineering ways used in temple building. The digging's recovery of thousands of cuneiform tablets from living and business contexts showed how deeply religious ideas entered daily life in Babylonian society. The discovery of the Enuma Elish creation story among the Babylon tablets gave teachers the most complete account of Marduk's rise to highest power within the Anunnaki ranking, and showed the fancy religious arguments that Babylonian teachers had developed to justify their city's political control. The story's detailed description of ancient chaos, god conflict, and cosmic organizing offered never-before insight into Mesopotamian cosmological thinking, while showing the literary fanciness that characterized mature Babylonian religious pieces. The writing's 7 tablets, each having approximately 150 lines of carefully structured poetry, stood for one of the longest and most complex literary works recovered from ancient Mesopotamia. Leonard Woolley's digging at Ur between 1922 and 1934 revolutionized understanding of early Mesopotamian culture and gave dramatic proof for the wealth and fanciness of Sumerian religious places. The discovery of the royal cemetery, with its fancy burial goods and proof for human killing going along with royal burials, showed the extraordinary supplies that early Mesopotamian societies gave to making sure proper connections between earthly rulers and god powers. The cemetery's most spectacular find, the burial of Queen Puabi with her full group of attendants, showed the extent to which Sumerian ideas of god kingship needed complex ritual ways that kept cosmic order through royal death and resurrection. Woolley's identification of flood deposits at many levels within the digging gave archaeological proof that supported the historical basis for Mesopotamian flood stories, though the localized nature of these deposits showed that the Great Flood showed area rather than global disaster events. The digging's recovery of votive objects, cylinder seals, and building remains from the early dynastic time explained the growth of Sumerian religious art and temple building, while cuneiform tablets from later times wrote down the continued importance of as a center for moon worship and star watching throughout Mesopotamian history. The joint trip to Nippur done by the University of Pennsylvania and other places beginning in 1888 gave the first systematic exploring of Mesopotamia's most important religious center, and yielded the largest collection of Sumerian literary and religious writings ever discovered. The digging of the Enlil temple group showed the building changing of Mesopotamian religious building over more than 3,000 years, while the recovery of over 50,000 cuneiform tablets and pieces from the temple records gave never-before writing down of Sumerian religious activities, running ways, and literary stories. Samuel Noah Kramer's lifelong dedication to changing and reading the Nippur tablets revolutionized teacher understanding of Sumerian culture and set up the basic importance of Sumerian religious thought for all later Mesopotamian cultural growth. Kramer's identification of numerous firsts in human culture among the Sumerian writings, including the first literary pieces, the first historical records, and the first systematic religious thinking, showed the foundational job that Sumerian culture had played in human thinking growth. His translation of Sumerian hymns, myths, and stories showed the fancy literary ways and complex religious ideas that characterized mature Sumerian religious thought. Kramer's work on Sumerian creation myths, including the piece known as The Debate Between Grain and Sheep, explained the hands-on worries that underlay Mesopotamian religious thinking, and showed how religious stories served to explain and justify the farming and pastoral activities that kept up urban culture. His translation of writings describing the sacred marriage between Inanna and Dumuzi gave detailed information about ritual activities that renewed god power and ensured farming baby-making, while his work on Sumerian flood stories showed the religious tensions that had led to God's choices to destroy and recreate human culture. Thorkild Jacobson's comparative study of Mesopotamian religious growth gave the theoretical system that enabled teachers to understand the changing of Anunnaki religion from its earliest Sumerian beginnings through its final changing during the Hellenistic time. Jacobson's identification of distinct phases in Mesopotamian religious thought, from the early democracy of the gods through the later stress on individual god highest position, explained how changing political and social conditions had influenced religious growth while keeping needed continuity in basic religious ideas. Jacobson's detailed study of Mesopotamian creation myths showed the fancy political metaphors that underlay apparently simple stories, showing how stories about god conflicts and cosmic organizing showed contemporary worries about earthly ruling and social order. His work on the Atrahasis story explained the money and population pressures that had shaped Mesopotamian thinking about god-human connections, while his study of the Enuma Elish showed the religious innovations that had enabled Babylonian teachers to change traditional religious ideas to serve empire political needs. The discovery of the library at Sultan Tepe in southeastern Turkey during digging, done by Seton Lloyd and Nuri Gox in the 1950s, gave teachers with more copies of major Mesopotamian literary works, and showed the extent to which traditional religious writings had been kept and studied in provincial centers throughout the Assyrian Empire. The library's collection of standard literary works, including many copies of the Gilgamesh story and different Anunnaki hymns, showed the systematic efforts that Assyrian teachers had made to keep and make the same Mesopotamian religious literature. The Sultan Tepe tablets included commentaries and teacher studies of classical writings that showed the fancy interpretive ways that ancient teachers had developed for understanding complex story and religious ideas. These commentaries gave modern teachers with ancient explanations of unclear references and technical word meanings, enabling more accurate translation and reading of difficult parts in major literary works. The library's keeping of both standard writings and teacher commentaries showed the continuity of thinking tradition that had kept Mesopotamian religious and literary culture across many centuries of political upset. French digging at Mari done by André Perret, beginning in 1933, uncovered a major running center from the old Babylonian time and gave a big write-down of religious activities and political connections during a crucial time of Mesopotamian history. The palace records at Mari had over 25,000 cuneiform tablets that wrote down diplomatic correspondence, running ways, and religious activities that explained the hands-on working of god kingship and temple running during the early second thousand-year period BCE. The Mari letters included detailed accounts of prophetic activities and god talking that showed how Mesopotamian rulers kept connections with patron gods and looked for god guidance for political and war choices. These writings gave solid proof for the hands-on working of religious ideas that had before been known primarily through literary and story sources, showing how beliefs about god power changed into actual political and running ways. The recovery of Akkadian literary writings from different sites throughout Mesopotamia enabled teachers to trace the growth of Anunnaki mythology through different times and areas, showing both continuity and innovation in religious thought across more than 2,000 years. The identification of many forms of major pieces, including different editions of the Gilgamesh story and different stories about creation and flood stories, showed the dynamic character of Mesopotamian religious literature and the ongoing efforts that ancient teachers had made to change traditional stories to contemporary worries. Archaeological investigation at Eridu, done by Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd during the 1940s and 1950s, gave crucial proof for the earliest growth of Mesopotamian religious building and confirmed the site's traditional identification as the first city set up by the gods. The digging showed 17 one after another temple levels dating from the Ubaid time through the Neo-Babylonian era, writing down the continuous religious importance of the site over more than 4,000 years. The earliest temple levels showed fancy building planning that set up design rules later adopted throughout Mesopotamia, while votive objects and building features showed the early growth of religious ideas that would later be developed in complex religious systems. The continuing discovery and publication of cuneiform writings from museum collections and new digging has given teachers with an ever-expanding body of primary sources for understanding Anunnaki religion and Mesopotamian religious activities. Major writing additions, including the ongoing Chicago Assyrian Dictionary Project and the Pennsylvania Sumerian Dictionary, have made possible increasingly fancy study of religious word meanings and religious ideas, while better understanding of Mesopotamian historical growth has enabled more accurate placing of religious writings within their original cultural and political settings. Modern archaeological ways, including satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and systematic surface survey, have identified hundreds of before unknown Mesopotamian sites and gave new opportunities for understanding the land giving out and area difference of Anunnaki worship. These technological advances have enabled archaeologists to investigate sites that were before not able to reach, while minimizing damage to fragile archaeological remains, making sure that future generations of teachers will have access to well-kept proof for understanding ancient Mesopotamian culture. The putting together of archaeological proof with writing sources has created an increasingly fancy understanding of how Anunnaki religion developed within specific historical and cultural contexts, while comparing study with other ancient Near Eastern religious stories has explained the distinctive characteristics of Mesopotamian religious thought. This many-subject approach has shown the complexity and fanciness of ancient Mesopotamian culture, while showing its basic importance for understanding the growth of human religious and thinking culture. The systematic recovery of Mesopotamian writing and archaeological proof throughout the 19th and 20th centuries set up a solid academic foundation for understanding the historical job of the Anunnaki within ancient Near Eastern culture. Contemporary teacher agreement recognizes these gods as central figures in the world's earliest urban religious systems, standing for fancy religious ideas that controlled cosmic order, political rightness, and social organizing throughout 3,000 years of Mesopotamian history. Leading Assyriologists including Jeremy Black, Andrew George, and Mark van de Meerup have shown through careful writing study and archaeological matching that the Anunnaki functioned as running gods whose power included both heavenly events and earthly ruling, creating put-together systems of god kingship that kept up the world's first complex urban societies. Modern academic reading stresses the Anunnaki's job as patron gods of specific city-states, with individual gods like Enlil at Nippur, Marduk at Babylon, and Inanna at Uruk working as god rulers whose earthly temples functioned as complete running centers handling farming making, craft specializing, and long-distance trade networks. Archaeological proof from sites like Eridu, Nippur, and shows the huge infrastructure needed to support these religious places, with temple groups employing thousands of workers and controlling huge farming lands that created the surplus wealth needed for monumental building projects and complex ritual cycles. The religious fanciness of Anunnaki worship comes up clearly from comparing study of creation myths, flood stories, and god family trees kept in cuneiform literature, spanning from early dynastic Sumerian pieces through Neo-Babylonian teacher commentaries. These writings show systematic religious thinking that addressed basic questions about cosmic beginnings, god power, human purpose, and moral order through complex stories that worked for both religious and political jobs within Mesopotamian society. The Atrahasis stories account of human creation as god workers, the Enuma Elish's reason for Babylonian political highest position through Marduk's cosmic winning, and the different flood stories exploring of god justice show the thinking rigor that characterized mature Mesopotamian religious thought. Academic research has also explained the historical growth of Anunnaki religion through one after another times of political and cultural change, showing how these religious ideas changed to serve different social needs, while keeping needed continuity across thousands of years of historical changing. The changing from early Sumerian ideas of god democracy through later Babylonian stress on single god power shows changing political realities, while the putting together of foreign gods into traditional Anunnaki rankings during times of cultural contact shows the flexibility that enabled these religious stories to survive conquering and population change. However, the academic understanding of Anunnaki as historical religious events has been overshadowed in popular culture by other readings that treat these gods as extraterrestrial visitors who influenced early human culture through advanced technology and genetic manipulation. These theories, popularized primarily through the works of authors like Zecharia Sitchin, Erich von Däniken, and more recently Ancient Aliens television programming, suggested that Sumerian writings describing god activities should be understood as literal accounts of aliens stepping in rather than stories showing religious and political ideas. Sitchin's translation and reading of Sumerian and Akkadian writings, beginning with his 1976 publication, The 12th Planet, claimed to show proof for an additional planet called Nibiru, whose inhabitants, the Anunnaki, traveled to Earth approximately 450,000 years ago to mine gold needed for their home planet's air maintenance. According to Sitchin's reading, these extraterrestrial beings genetically modified existing hominid species to create modern humans as a slave workforce, setting up the first human cultures in Mesopotamia before departing Earth with promises to return during future planet lineups. Sitchin's theories gained a substantial popular following through their presentation in accessible language that promised to show hidden truths about human beginnings while explaining the rapid growth of culture in ancient Mesopotamia. His reading of cuneiform writings stressed passages describing god beings coming down from heaven, teaching humans different technologies, and having powers that seemed to go beyond normal human abilities. The author's background in economics and journalism, combined with his claimed know-how in ancient languages, lent apparent credibility to his readings among audiences lacking specialized knowledge of Mesopotamian studies. The ancient astronaut hypothesis expanded beyond Sitchin's specific readings through the work of authors like von Däniken, whose Chariots of the Gods suggested that different ancient monuments and artifacts worldwide gave proof for extraterrestrial visiting. Von Däniken's approach stressed visual proof, including building doings that seemed to go beyond ancient technology abilities, artistic pictures that resembled modern aircraft or astronauts, and stories from many cultures describing god beings with advanced powers and technologies. The popularity of these other theories shows broader cultural fascination with extraterrestrial life and dissatisfaction with conventional academic explanations for the rapid growth of human culture during the Neolithic Revolution. The ancient astronaut hypothesis offers seemingly simple solutions to complex historical questions, while appealing to contemporary scientific ideas about space travel and genetic engineering that make alien stepping in appear plausible within modern technology systems. Professional Assyriologists and archaeologists have consistently said no to these other readings through detailed study of the language, archaeological, and historical proof that goes against extraterrestrial visiting theories. Michael Heiser's complete critique of Sitchin's translations in the Unseen Realm shows numerous errors in cuneiform reading and reading that undermine the foundation for ancient astronaut claims, while Irving Finkel's study of Mesopotamian flood stories in the Ark before Noah shows the complex literary and religious growth that made these pieces over centuries of cultural changing. The archaeological record gives no proof for the advanced technologies that would have been needed for interplanetary travel during ancient times, while the slow growth of Mesopotamian culture through one after another cultural phases goes against claims about sudden technology advancement through aliens stepping in. Digging at sites like Tel Ez Sawin, Choga Mami, and early Uruk show the step-by-step growth of farming ways, craft specializing, and urban organizing that made the complex societies written about in later historical times. Despite academics saying no, ancient astronaut theories have deeply influenced popular culture through their putting it into science fiction literature, television programming, and internet-based other history communities. The History Channel's Ancient Aliens series, which has made over 200 episodes since 2009, presents these theories as right scientific hypotheses worthy of serious thinking, featuring interviews with supporters alongside dramatic reenactments and computer-created imagery that creates compelling visual stories supporting extraterrestrial reading of ancient proof. The series format typically presents conventional archaeological and historical proof alongside other readings that stress unexplained parts of ancient doings, creating false equivalences between set-up teacher agreement and thinking theories lacking factual support. This presentation strategy appeals to audiences skeptical of academic power while satisfying entertainment preferences for dramatic stories that promise revolutionary revelations about human history and cosmic importance. The influence of Anunnaki ideas on contemporary literature and imaginative fiction reaches far beyond ancient astronaut theories through their putting it into fantasy and science fiction stories that draw inspiration from Mesopotamian mythology, while changing these ideas to serve modern storytelling purposes. Authors like Neil Gaiman in American Gods and Kim Stanley Robinson in The Years of Rice and Salt have put in Mesopotamian gods into complex stories exploring themes of cultural change, religious changing, and human changing to technological advancement. The video game industry has particularly embraced Mesopotamian story ideas through games like Assassin's Creed and Civilization that allow players to interact with historical cultures, while putting in fantastical elements from ancient religious stories. These interactive media create immersive experiences that introduce players to Mesopotamian cultural ideas while changing them into entertainment content that may bear little resemblance to their original historical contexts. Contemporary neo-pagan and Reconstructionist religious movements have tried to revive authentic Mesopotamian religious activities through careful study of cuneiform sources and archaeological proof, creating modern religious communities that honor traditional Anunnaki while changing ancient activities to contemporary social and legal contexts. The Mesopotamian Reconstructionist movement, though relatively small, includes practitioners who have learned cuneiform script, studied ancient ritual ways, and created modern changings of traditional ceremonies that keep religious continuity with ancient activities. These contemporary practitioners face big challenges in reconstructing authentic ancient religious activities from incomplete writing and archaeological sources, while also changing stories developed for ancient urban temple communities to serve the needs of modern individuals and small groups. The absence of continuous traditional transmission needs modern practitioners to rely on teacher readings of ancient sources, creating religious activities that may differ substantially from their ancient ones that came before despite sincere tries at historical rightness. The Sumerian Mesopotamian Orthodox Temple movement, set up by practitioners looking to create authentic reconstructions of ancient religious stories, has developed ritual activities based on careful study of cuneiform prayer writings and archaeological proof for temple ways. These groups typically stress historical rightness over contemporary spiritual needs, creating religious activities that prioritize faithfulness to ancient sources even when this creates hands-on difficulties for modern practitioners. Other contemporary groups have adopted more flexible approaches that honor Mesopotamian gods while putting in modern spiritual ideas and activities that address contemporary religious needs. These blended movements may combine Anunnaki worship with elements from other ancient stories, modern witchcraft activities, or New Age spirituality, creating religious systems that draw inspiration from Mesopotamian sources while serving the spiritual needs of modern practitioners. The academic study of these contemporary religious movements has shown the complex connection between historical teaching and modern spiritual activities, with Reconstructionist groups working as both consumers and critics of academic research on ancient Mesopotamian religion. These practitioners often have fancy knowledge of cuneiform sources and archaeological proof that enables them to engage critically with teacher readings while developing their own understanding of ancient religious ideas and activities. The influence of Anunnaki ideas on contemporary culture reaches beyond explicit religious or other history movements through their putting it into broader cultural stories about human beginnings, technology growth, and cosmic importance. The themes of God creation, technology advancement, and moral judgment that characterize Mesopotamian mythology continue to resonate with modern audiences through their appearance in science fiction, fantasy literature, and popular philosophy that addresses basic questions about human nature and fate. The digital age has created new opportunities for keeping and sharing knowledge about Anunnaki stories through online databases, digital records, and interactive teaching resources that make cuneiform writings and archaeological proof accessible to global audiences. Projects like the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative and the Open Richly Annotated Cuneiform Corpus give teachers and interested individuals access to thousands of primary sources that were previously available only to specialists with access to major research libraries. These digital resources have made access to Mesopotamian source materials more democratic, while also creating new challenges for distinguishing between accurate teacher information and other readings that may lack factual support. The Internet's ability for rapid information sharing has enabled both academic research and pseudoscientific theories to reach global audiences at the same time, needing users to develop critical evaluation skills for assessing the reliability of different sources and readings. The contemporary legacy of Anunnaki stories thus includes many parallel streams of reading and use that serve different cultural jobs within modern society. Academic teaching continues to refine understanding of these gods' historical jobs within ancient Mesopotamian culture, while other theories give entertainment and thinking systems for understanding human beginnings. Religious reconstructionist movements try to revive authentic ancient activities, while popular culture changes Mesopotamian ideas to serve contemporary storytelling and spiritual needs. The enduring appeal of Anunnaki ideas across these diverse contemporary uses shows the basic importance of the questions that these ancient stories addressed about cosmic order, God power, human purpose, and moral duty. Whether approached as historical events worthy of teacher investigating, extraterrestrial visitors offering solutions to cosmic mysteries, or God beings deserving contemporary worship, the Anunnaki continue to give systems for understanding humanity's place within larger cosmic and historical contexts. The teacher agreement about Anunnaki as fancy religious ideas developed within the world's earliest urban cultures gives the most reliable foundation for understanding their historical importance and continuing relevance. These gods stood for humanity's first systematic tries to understand cosmic order, political power, and moral duty through complex stories that put together religious, political, and hands-on worries within complete worldviews that kept up urban culture for over 3,000 years. The keeping of Anunnaki stories through cuneiform literature and archaeological remains makes sure that these ancient ideas will continue to influence human understanding of religious, political, and cultural growth, regardless of how contemporary readers choose to understand their final importance. The careful work of teachers who have recovered, changed, and read these sources gives future generations access to humanity's earliest systematic religious and philosophical thinking, showing both the continuity and creativity that have characterized human thinking growth throughout recorded history. Anunnaki's journey from active gods controlling ancient Mesopotamian city-states to subjects of contemporary academic study, popular thinking, and religious revival shows the complex ways through which ancient cultural stories change to serve new social and thinking needs, while keeping much-needed continuity with their historical beginnings. Their continuing presence in modern talk, whether through teacher study, other theories, or contemporary religious activities, testifies to the enduring power of the basic questions about human existence, cosmic order, and God power that these ancient stories first systematically addressed over 5,000 years ago.